Okay, let's do this the third time.
There you go. There you go. Third time's a charm. I'll start it up again. Sorry, gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me today. The talk I'm going to run you guys through, it runs in two parts. So the first part, I'm just going to give you a brief rundown of the PhD project I've just finished putting together on the measurement and mitigation of vigilance decrement in network defense personnel.
Sounds suitably complex now. Yeah, okay.
Vigilance decrement essentially stands for biologically predetermined lapses in attention. But I'll expand on that in a little bit more. The minds that operate your systems, particularly your security systems, they have three components. So there's three components to those systems. You've got the hardware, you've got the software, and then you've got the human operator's attention system. It's actually located right here, just over the anterior frontal lobe. There for the camera, I think you can see that. Now the problem is, this exact part of your brain is what controls your ability to pay attention, particularly to repetitive tasks.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, repetitive tasks like network defense.
It is moving all by itself.
I'm not sure what does that.
Okay. Right.
I'll just correct.
Yeah, okay.
Now the hardware, software, it's easy to upgrade a chip in a board or a piece of code inside some software. Much harder for evolution to naturally select an upgrade to the hardware inside the mind or even the psychology that is the software of the brain. That takes around about 900 billion years. So in the meantime, what can science do to actually help you with that problem? That was effectively the motivation for the beginning of this project. Now, vigilance decrement. So first off, vigilance, that just stands for sustained attention. So you're vigilant when you're driving, hopefully. When you're driving, those are tasks that require certain vigilance, including threat detection using intrusion detection software or any sort of command and control console that you'll see inside a SOC or a scene. So intrusion detection systems, they're quite hard to pay attention to for long periods of time. In fact, they're often a bottleneck to a network defense analyst's capacity to do their work is simply to pay attention to the consoles that they're using. And what we actually see, is, particularly in military spaces, is that over time, the number of errors that network defense analysts will make, they tend to compound, and this is called vigilance decrement over time. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So what that can look like is you sit down to work at 9 a.m. on a Monday. Come around about 20 minutes past 9, you are biologically no longer capable to be 100% proficient at that job. You can drop from around about 100% attention capacity right down to 70, and in worst cases down to 40, sort of thing. So it ranges between 40 and 100%. The issue is that it only takes about 20 minutes, if not less, on a harder IDS console for those lapses in attention to start and then increasingly occur. So it's not just that they're making mistakes. It's the rate of mistakes also increase. And that's before you even get into, okay, what about the size of mistake? It's one thing for me to mis-enter a password when I'm trying to log in. It's another thing entirely for me to miss a massive, say a DDoS or any given alert in an IDS.
Is this related to, I used to teach a lot of courses, and when they first were doing training with us, they said that, the average, in fact, this is not going to make any sense, but the average maximum attention period that people had is about 40 minutes. And so they always used to break up the courses into 30 minutes of talking and then say 20 minutes of exercise and stuff like that to actually break up people's, deliberately get them out of that mode. Otherwise, they just would stop absorbing stuff, which is why 3-hour lectures and all these other big talks are kind of wank because exactly that. Is it related to that, as in that 20-minute time period, which is because you're trying to maintain that focus? Chemically, I assume there's something in here that basically just takes that away.
You've hit exactly the system, the cellular system. That 20 minutes is linked to something very important. It's a cellular thing. I'm explaining exactly where that comes from in a moment.
Cool.
But to answer your question, that's actually exactly what we're talking about. As it turns out, the more complicated the job is, or rather, the greater the amount of processing that someone needs to put into, the more amount of work someone needs to put into paying attention to something,
the less time they can do it for.
Yeah, exactly. The faster that moment that those error rates begin to just explode. So I'll show you what biologically that looks like. So vigilance decrement. So you see it in cognitively demanding tasks. Repetition and monotony are important components of that, but it's effectively any repetitive space in which you see a compounding of errors over time. Now this area of the brain in yellow just on the top. Now that's the area I'm talking about here. This is the circuit board. This is the hardware that is running your security systems. This is exactly that part on the chip that things go wrong. It gets overloaded in effect, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. Now, the purpose of this PhD was to see if we couldn't measure attention, just the capacity for attention. Because in doing so, what you can then do is take that across to a SOC and measure how well an analyst is able to pay attention, etc., etc. But I'll get into applications in a moment. So I just mentioned to you that this was a cellular thing. I'll explain what's actually happening now when a network defense analyst loses attention. So a bit of neurobio. The brain has essentially two fuel sources. Now, the first one is glucose. It's the primary fuel source that comes through your blood, and it's the fuel that's used most of the time under most operating conditions. But you've also got this thing called glycogen. Now, glycogen is a special reserve form of glucose. So it's a spare fuel tank. But the thing is, it's a very limited fuel tank. And it's only really accessed when you need to reach the maximum level of processing capacity. So the analogy I have for this is glucose is what you use when you're cruising down the highway. Glycogen is what you access when you're at a drag race and you want to go that extra speed.
Right, so it's like the nitrous.
It's exactly like the nitrous. That is, you saw exactly where I was going with that. So I'll just show you what I mean by that. If I can make this work. Here we go. So the plot that I have on the left is the type of activity that you're going to see on a task that requires attention, but not a lot of processing power. So this is what driving, for example, would look like. Now at the...
I don't know, videos and Macs and PowerPoint don't always play nicely.
Oh, no, it's the mouse at this point. No, cannot play media.
Okay, all right.
That's okay. I'll show you on this. This is a whiteboard, yeah?
Yeah.
Sweet. Sorry, Andy, can you see me on the whiteboard?
If you keep talking, the camera will actually flick to you. So,
sweet.
Yeah,
Okay.
so just keep talking and it'll figure it out.
Sweet as. So I'll just move down so the camera can get at me. So on this vertical axis, I have activity. And this is just time. Now notice down on the bottom of those plots, you've got a glucose measuring tube and a glycogen measuring tube. Now, when you're doing a simple task and you're paying attention to a simple task that's repetitive, your brain will sustain a level of activity that it's pretty happy at. Now, it's going to have a maximum level and it's going to have a minimum level, but it's largely going to stay within a certain band of functioning. Now, that's when you're just using your glucose. That's just based on what's in your blood. But if you have to step it up a gear, your brain goes, all right, we can up the level of activity and you'll still have that same level of noise as you saw down here. In fact, the region between which that activity is going to bounce is also the same. But what ends up happening is what ends up happening is to boost. So this is just glycogen alone. Glucose alone. This is glucose plus glycogen. It accesses that spare fuel reserve, just like the nitrous in the drag car. It boosts its overall speed. But the problem with that, you can get to this level of activity. This is what running an IDS looks like. But because you're using that spare fuel tank, eventually it runs out. And what you're going to be left with is the amount of energy that you usually use on a task that is simpler than running an IDS. So think of it like this. This is the task demand, especially metadata analysis in intrusion detection systems. Very, very difficult job. That's the demand of the task. But if your fuel tank runs out after 20 minutes into an 8-hour-long shift, the performance that you see here is not going to butter the parsnips, as it were. So that's essentially how your attention system works. Now, at a low level of attention, you're just going to be using blood. At a high level of attention, you can sustain it, but only for about 20 minutes before that fuel tank runs out. After that, all you're left with is what you've got in blood. And you know that that's not enough, because if you access that spare fuel reserve to perform the task in the first place, then blood-based alone isn't going to cut it. So what do?
Drugs.
That is an option, actually. There are options. I'll tell you a story about the US Air Force and their fighter pilots in a minute. So I looked at this problem and I thought, well, maybe I can use a brain scanner to fix it. So So I've done a couple things with this PhD. Now, the first thing I've done, which you'll see in the background of this diagram here, I've developed essentially a flight sim of intrusion detection systems. Now, there's no one intrusion detection system off of which you can build a simulation. So I'm going to explain that part of it in a minute. But on top of that as well, so the idea is in this experiment, I have this simulated IDS. It's a metadata anomaly detection task. As me, or the participant, is performing this task, what I'm doing is I'm using this little thing here. It's called a functional near-infrared spectroscope. shines a light into your brain, it bounces around, bounces out, and we can measure how much activity is going on right at that center that we know is the failure point. I'm also using a heart rate monitor to measure your heart rate, because heart rate is the thing that's going to shuttle that glucose into your brain as well. So this is the baseline level of fuel delivery. This is the amount of fuel that it's using. So we can essentially gauge not just how much fuel is the brain using, but how much is it also drawing on from your blood systems. The idea is that we can look for lapses in attention on that simulation, and when we see it, we can essentially look for identifiers in the biology of the person's brain. So I'll explain a bit about that simulation now, because it all hinges on this task. So, as I said, it's like a flight sim, but for CSOC work. The only other people who have anything approximating this is the United States Air Force. Their versions of this suck. Like, they're not good. And a testament to that is all of their simulations use a single computer monitor. I haven't seen a SOC anywhere that uses a single computer monitor in which to interact with the threat landscape. So mine is a 3-screen design. It involves a work queue, a signal test. Essentially, if an icon over here starts flashing, you need to just react to it. You hit a Control D. This stuff here is a lot more directly related to cyber. This is more cognitive, but this central screen here is more cyber. So the participant clicks on the work queue. It pops down an SSLBL threat report. And that SSLBL threat report then has to be entered correctly here. So for example, a corporate privacy violation. That's a very high top priority security alert. So they'd rate that as a level 1. A DDoS, well, that's definitely less than a corporate privacy violation, so we'll rate that a level 2. So they rate these threats on a scale of 1 to 5, and they must get them correct. As they do that, these things are then produced on this right screen subtask. At any point in time that one of these charts touches that black line, that's classified as an anomaly that the person then has to identify for. They identify it by typing it into the top here and then confirming the alert. Where I'm going with this is essentially that this simulation does not look like an intrusion detection system, but that's just beside the point. The way that this was designed was along 3 parameters of cognitive design, cognitive elements of design that actually make you more likely to lose attention over time. So, for example, the rate at which these things are flickering. The faster that they're flickering, the more likely that you are to miss them. The slower that they are, the more likely you are to identify them. Likewise with these things. If the IP address that you have to remember is an easy string of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's not as hard to remember as 26.75.68.36. So we're essentially testing the working memory there. And insofar as this right screen subtask is concerned, what we're looking at is your graphical capacity. So this does not draw on cyber. This looks at, okay, psychologically, what is probably failing when attention lapses in an IDS? It's probably these 3 factors. These 3 factors are designed into this simulation so that it doesn't have to look like an IDS out in the wild. It just has to stress those components of the brain that we know to cause lapses in attention. And the name of this is the West Australian Cyber Defence Task. So essentially in this PhD, they perform this task, and I go looking for biosignatures of failure. You don't need to know about that one. So I just want to run you through some of the results so far. So all the experiments are done, but effectively this is the sort of plot that we get out of it. So there were 2 versions of this task that were tested. Now in the first version, call that the static version. All of the parameters that make this thing cognitively difficult were set to stay the same. Now, I don't know about you guys, but in the SOCs that I've seen, nothing always stays the same. You either have periods of very busy periods or very slow periods or something in between. So I wanted to test what's more dangerous, or rather, when are lapses in attention more likely? Quiet times, busy times, or transitional times? This line in red is the sort of network defense performance you can see when things stay the same. People get used to things, so they get better at it. But during periods of transition, slow to fast or fast to slow, that's when performance drops. The worrying part about this is that we can also see this performance has some indicators neurologically. So the red aligns with red, the blue aligns with blue. This is the brain scan data. Now, consider this. When performance is declining, the line goes up, down, up. When performance is improving, it just goes straight down. it's a very clear biosignature that you can then feed into a machine learning algorithm to tell you if a network defense operator needs a break. And what kind of break as well is also important, because this could indicate that maybe they just don't have enough sugar in their blood to even get you to that boosted state yet. Effectively, though, what this gives you is a biological indicator that a network defense analyst is capable of being at the job or being on the terminal.
So the way I read that on that graph on the left, if you've got steady state going on, and I don't know exactly where the levels are supposed to be at, but I'm just going to call this out. Let's say you get to 60 minutes and you go, okay, that person definitely needs a break. Assuming that it's, as you say, it's a steady state, things aren't changing, they're just monitoring stuff. Whereas it looks like, in the blue state where things are in transition and doing this, looks like they're getting a lot more done in the 60 minutes, because that graph of, because that's all, O2 saturation and stuff like that, that actually looks good.
Which one, the blue or
the blue in the left graph, the numbers go up, right? So
okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. That is a very nuanced question. You ask cool questions. So I'll explain it like this, right? Now, if performance improvement, actually, the question you've asked hinges around, sorry, I hope it's okay to touch this.
Just don't draw on it.
It hinges around this initial peak here. Now, what this means is that up to this point, that's when your brain accesses that spare fuel tank. But once that spare fuel tank runs out, it just tanks.
Right.
Because there's nothing to metabolize with oxygen. So, okay, but then it gets to the bottom. Now, when it improves, that doesn't happen. The theoretical explanation that I have for this difference is a thing of nutrient distribution. In some people, and this will probably be the case in your more experienced network defense personnel, their brain is so used to the task that it just naturally distributes nutrients in a way. It's just going to naturally distribute nutrients to where it needs to be in the brain. Whereas under this blue situation, what we suspect is happening is that once the brain has run out of that cellular reserve of fuel, it just floods the brain with blood, because blood is the only other source of fuel that it has access to. So the thinking is that it's an optimization thing. Someone who's spent a lot of time in a SOC is going to be able to be more efficient with limited fuel resources, or once that spare fuel tanks run out, than if someone with less experience whose brain is still adapting to the demands of that job as well.
So, Oliver, are you saying as an outcome, potentially you can use machine learning to prompt for breaks of operators?
Not only breaks, can prompt for things like snacks as well.
And build that into the system?
You can build that into, better than that actually, you could use this system to ask the reverse question of that. What does the system need to do to not overload someone into this problem state here? So effectively imagine this. So you sit down to your IDS console after you've finished performing one of these tasks. It knows what your cognitive sensitivities are. It knows what type of event rate and signal salience is going to get your mind to lose focus. So it adapts itself for you so you don't lose that focus. In effect, you can think of it like a dynamic way of building an IDS so that it is constantly gripping the user's attention, which you want in a security space like this. Any questions so far?
Does it have an impact on, say, people watching television shows and movies in terms of, if you think about all the really, really good movies that you see, generally they're in 3 acts. Generally, if you think of an action movie or whatever, there's this, this big spike of, thing at the beginning that you're concentrating on and you're watching, and then they deliberately back off. Right, okay. In order not to overload you, and then they'll push you into the next one. Because if you're watching a movie that goes for 3 hours, and I'm thinking of you, Lord of the Rings, where you've got to be concentrating the whole time and there's no break. You fall asleep halfway through it because you're just like, okay, this is actually too much to take in. Whereas, there's no doubt it's a good movie, but at the same time, if you watch a real movie that you get out of it and you feel energized, it's because they've taken you through those highs and lows as part of the movie, which is what I'm seeing here as well, right? In that because you're talking about building the IDS in a way that constantly grips your attention, you still need to have it, and again, this is where the breaks come in, right? Back people off so that they can recover in order to come back and do that high cognitive load again. Absolutely.
But if you look at that question from the perspective of a manager of a CSOC, what you've therefore got is a team of people who you want them to be as not tired as possible in order to fulfill their job as best they can. But then that gets more complicated because out of 10 people, Jack might need a break after 15 minutes, Jill might need a break after 20. Steve might not need a break for 6 hours. But what this system lets you do is it doesn't mean you have to guess anymore.
Yeah, you can actually figure it out.
So that analysis goes to the manager. And
The analysis goes to the
managers
manager.
say, like, Bob needs to go for a break or...
Exactly.
Jill, right, okay.
Exactly. Another parallel would be, if you guys are into the F1, they'll keep track of the guy's heart rate and a few biosignatures, because if the driver starts freaking out, or rather, if they start showing too great a stress response, especially in a car like that, they will crash.
Yeah.
It's effectively a similar analogy. So rather than, and it also removes questions of work ethic as well. If you can tell that someone is neurologically, they've simply depleted their reserves of energy, then it changes how you manage them as well.
That's a really interesting point, that question of work ethic. Like if because you can't measure work like on a, everyone works 60 minutes.
Scale,
It's like there's different levels of work. Yeah, that's interesting.
It cuts through that, and it really lets you assess, okay, what is the IDS analyst doing insofar as they're also an athlete performing a task, sort of thing. So what are the applications of this? And absolutely, this mainly goes to the manager. So the manager would get something like I picture an anonymized team-based report, because it's also team-based work, which means you also have to have team-based metrics. So an anonymized team-based report on the basis of how well each member out of that team performs on the IDS. But it gets a bit cooler than that. That simulation that I showed you, that can actually be calibrated psychologically or cognitively speaking to any IDS that you could ever show me. So if you just pick one randomly out of the universe and plonk it in front of me, what I can do is I can measure just how cognitively stressful each of those factors are that are simulated in the WACDT. I can measure how much that IDS, how difficult it is for that IDS to be run. I can calibrate it within my simulation. And then if you know that you need 50 people on an IDS platform in a week, you've got 1,000 people, pick which one. You run those 1,000 people through that calibrated task, and it'll rank, and essentially it'll rank them in terms of who is most suited to working on that system for you without even showing them anything in-house. It allows you to test that psychologically speaking. That's another aspect of it. So identify analysts who perform better under different types of cognitive loads, but more importantly, it could reinform how you design the IDS itself. So for example, rather than having just simply user settings in which the user can adapt things, or maybe you've actually got a smart system that changes itself based on what it measures in the person's brain. Thank you. Now another application of this system is in what I like to call them battle scenarios. So tomorrow, a new type of cyber threat could be invented that no one has ever seen before, and it's a bit of a problem. Now it may not have hit your organization yet, but you want to know, just as a manager, what's the probability that if one of these random new inventions finds its way into my IDS, what are the odds someone's going to pick it up? You can simulate that. So you can test different scenarios, and you can also do it with different people. So suppose you've got IT service desk level people who are trained in some degree in the internets of things. You can also examine, okay, who on the help desk has the biological capacity to maybe perform well if we sponsor their training up to an IDS analyst. Let you find more people to supplement your workforce need as well. In effect, what you're doing is you're benchmarking your staff on their cognitive capacities that you can physically measure, as opposed to, say, a questionnaire style of thing. Now, those are the applications of this. The first part, as it is, that was the first part of my talk. That's the project that I've worked on so far. Now, if there's any, I don't suppose any of you guys have any questions?
I think there's applications outside of just SOC.
Yeah.
If you think about the remote operations center that the BHP and Rio Tinto and FMG run, their workers have a very, very similar thing, right? They're remotely operating equipment. They've got lots of dashboards. They've got lots of screens. They're effectively stuck in a room where there's no outside stimulation, and that means they're likely to become more cognitively fatigued while operating that, because they're not looking out the front of a train and watching things go by, or getting slightly distracted for a moment by, a cloud and coming back and focusing, which is actually a good human way of
it's a regulatory function, no, absolutely so.
So I think there's probably wider implications here, but yeah, okay.
There certainly are wider implications, because you could also see implications for this in things like prisons. Like, it doesn't have to necessarily be a command and control console, or hospitals, actually. Hospitals and nursing staff in particular. anywhere where you've got a large number of computer screens and a singular small subset of humans required to take in all of that information, how do you design those systems so that rather than just chucking all of that information onto the user, which it's not just one chuck, it consistently evolves, how does the system finesse the way that it gives it to the user so their attention is maintained at its absolute optimal?
Have you talked to, there's a company out in Sugako called Isotana.
Never heard of them.
So they came out of a research project at Curtin because lots of people have lots and lots of closed circuit TV, and in the case of something like the London Underground, you have 10,000 cameras. Okay, it's not possible for human beings to monitor all of them all the time. So they built a bunch of machine learning algorithms that could identify what normal looked like, and therefore would also alert you when something abnormal happened. And so, for example, let's say the system hadn't been taught that someone sitting down on a train is a normal activity. It would start alerting, going, hey, there's all these people sitting down, that's really, really bad. And the person would just go like, oh, no, that's totally normal. It would go, oh, okay, I'm not going to tell anybody about that. But if it then saw somebody hitting someone else with an umbrella, for example, it would go, hey, I haven't seen that before, that's really unusual. And it would go, oh, yes, that is, we've got to send someone down there to fix that problem. And so their approach to, it's like part of this problem was to build machine learning algorithms in order to detect abnormalities, which is what machine learning is supposedly good at. But again, apply that to thousands, if not tens of thousands, of high definition video streams, and only pop up what was actually unusual.
So it's certainly not a trivial problem. That's a hugely complicated problem. Essentially, that's a great example as to why automation is not going to get you out of this hole. Because certainly, that's a brilliant example of the use of automation to reduce the number of people who have to be on the coalface, which is good. You reduce the number of people who need to be on the coalface. You also technically reduce the total number of errors, because that also constrains the total number of errors that you can make. One person can only get so much wrong, hopefully. But the issue that also presents is that it's how long is a piece of string? I mean, certainly you can reduce 10,000 security cameras down into maybe only a couple by using that AI. But who is able to man or operate that AI? The machine learning outputs to actually go yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week.
There's a human interaction at some point.
There's a human interaction at some point, and the more you introduce this automation, the more complex that role becomes, the more this is likely to happen. I'm not saying that it's not a solution, but what I'm also saying is you're looking at the hardware and the software of the system, but the hardware and the software of the user, there is also meat in the bone there to address this issue. And in fact, there's more meat in the bone there to address this issue than there is, I personally think, although I'm biased, insofar as AI and machine learning is concerned. Because this is ultimately my opinion now. If those things were going to have effectively solved this problem, it would have done so by now. The human factor is still so big an issue that those don't seem to be the bullet for the problem. But that's where cyber psychology comes into it. So within the project, I've demonstrated a biological way of working out just what the capacity is of a network defense analyst on the job. But there's so much more to cybersecurity insofar as the human factor is concerned. And I've heard one term thrown around a lot, which is that we need a shift in cyber culture. This specifically, I often hear it referred to things like password hygiene. The problem with culture is that several. First off, that's one aspect of psychology. This project has incorporated neuropsychology, a measurable way of looking at the brain and giving you an insight into cybersecurity. Now that is possible. It's a bit of a bow to draw, but it's possible. But it's quite a useful one, I think. It's quite a useful bow to draw. If you're only looking at trying to shift the cyber culture, the problem with culture is that it is the worship of the dead. That's what it's explained as in psychology. And what I mean by that is a person older than you encounters a problem and or a threat, solves it, moves on, tells you about it. That's what culture is. I've encountered a DDoS. Hang on, this is how you avoid a DDoS. Okay, go along your merry way. The problem with that is that the attackers are 2 steps ahead of you. Because what this guy here ahead of you is warning you about, whoever did it to him has moved on to something new. It's already worked for him. So that's why culture, you're already 2 steps behind the attacker. I mean, you're following the person who survived, but you're still behind the attacker. That's why you need things, I think, like an investigation into cyber psychology. What can the wider set of brain sciences do for you? And the answer is, I think, quite a lot. And it'll be for questions that haven't gone away for a while. The issue with passwords, for example. The reason people suck at password management, largely speaking, even though you've got services like LastPass now and like built into the iPhone, they'll track your password for you. Those also still haven't really solved the problem. It's because when you ask someone to create a password, you've asked them to create random meaning, something that is memorable to them, but not easily analyzed by someone else. The brain does not do random well unless you are sick. Specifically, if you've got schizophrenia, you can think of random very well, but you also can't tie your shoes. That's also essentially the problem with passwords. Now, in a healthy person, think of something random. What do people usually do? Their name, their children's name, their date of birth, their mum's date of birth. Things which are meaningful to them, that's just the thing that was closest to them in their brain. But that's essentially the aspect I mean behind this. There's so much meat on the bone insofar as psychology is concerned in cybersecurity. Oh my goodness, there's a whole career, I hope, there for me. But what I'd be interested in hearing from you guys is where you see this sort of playing out. Because I look at psychology insofar as it applies to cyber, and I just see huge potential there. But it's so much more than just a cultural shift. It's stuff like, what can you measure from the person? How can a system be redesigned so that it is cognitively efficient, cognitively optimized for the person to use? And what will actually this affect in terms of like our evolution of the workforce going forwards as well? Because if this is not addressed, then the systems that we design and build, they will just simply keep increasing in complexity. But the greatest threats to the security of an organization will still become the point of failure that is the human. Because if you can focus on hardware and software, but don't look at the human operator, where's the weakest point of failure? It's going to be in the human operator. Cyber psychology promises to actually give you some insight into that. It's a whole science. And the point I'd like to leave you with, I suppose, is that cybersecurity is a human behavior contrived by humans for the operation of humans in a human orchestrated environment. Cybersecurity is a human space. It's a human brain space. Merging of the sciences can give you wonderful insights. But that was my PhD talk, and that's where I see this sort of going, and thank you so much.
So,
very interesting.
What I was thinking about was anomaly detection, so across a whole range of fields, geospatial maps. People look at those for anomalies across those, but often make mistakes. So you can do ML to sort of minimize the amount of anomalies, but it still needs human interaction at some point. So yeah,
that's what this is. This is an anomaly detection subtask, and that's a brilliant point you raised, because that is, if anomaly detection is the cutting edge of where the human meets machine learning, that's where this is failing.
Yeah.
Well, no, I don't want to say failing, but that's where you see the rate of failures exponentially increasing, way more so than any other aspect of cyber. So thanks for that. But that's precisely what I mean. Like systems like this that operate on the assumption that you don't need to assess how they're going to work on every ODS. If your simulation essentially stress tests every component of their brain that's actually going to be doing the work.
Yeah.
But so that's my PhD.
Interesting.
Yeah. Interesting
So,
to see what you guys think.
practically, when you're monitoring people to look at, because your graph that you had back,
It was forwards from that, I believe.
Okay, there we go, that one there. So those graphs you were showing there, which were O2 saturation in the blood, blah blah blah, whatever. How are you getting that? Is that all from the brain scan thing you're using?
Yeah.
So if you wanted to do this in real time with people, you would need to have some funky looking helmet that they're going to wear.
No, just that. Just the little thing you saw on my head.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, you want to make them, think that they're doing something cool. So, let's give them the
like
flip
a
down goggles.
HoloLens.
Yeah. Just bed it into that, right? No, that's just that's fine,
You
right?
can wrap it up, absolutely. So yeah.
Okay, so you basically need to do that. Okay, all right.
I wonder if there's a challenge about people accepting it.
That's been investigated. A colleague of mine she's about halfway through doing her PhD into what would actually be the probability of network defense analysts strapping stuff to the head and going to work. Quite high probability. That's actually the reason the US Air Force were the first movers in this space, because that was their thinking. They wanted to use brain stimulation as well as dexamphetamine sulfate and this thing to work out, okay, analysts' attention has dropped, therefore apply brain stimulation and an amphetamine to get their ability to jump again.
Use electricity, just zap them. That'll get their attention.
That does actually work.
The manager's got to fall.
No, the moment you get a little bit sleepy, ow! Okay, all right, I'm awake now. Yeah.
That's exactly how I was educated. Wrong.
That's fascinating.
But yeah, it's effectively I wanted to do a PhD that actually gave someone a useful tool, something that was useful.
Really interesting.
But yeah, you can derive a lot from this, and questions like that are really important as well. Like, can you fix this with drugs? You absolutely can, but you don't want to. That's why brain stimulation is more.
Look, that has other side effects, no pun intended. But the other thing is, obviously, there's a lot of research going into fatigue, and particularly you were talking about driving cars before as well. So you have modern cars now that watch people's eyes to know whether they're falling asleep or not, and start doing things if the driver does that. And it would be interesting in this particular scenario to know whether, rather than having to have the patch which is tracking all that, whether you could do something with eye movements as well. Because you want to, and I don't know, right? I'm just throwing things out there, but you're looking for cognitive fatigue, and are there other tells with people that aren't just blood chemistry? I would posit that this is probably way more accurate. But there could be other ways of doing this.
The offset. No, that's important. Funny story about that, actually. Yeah. So in the picture of myself wearing the equipment, you'll notice that I'm wearing glasses that I'm not wearing today.
Yeah, I didn't think that was you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, who is this handsome man? No, these glasses actually. That was my thinking as well. Easier to give someone a piece of some eyeglasses than it is to strap this thing on their head. The problem is. This particular kind of glasses, they're called oculometers. They measure the geometry of the eye, so they're not an eye tracker. This particular model cost me $800 from a startup in France. The next model up cost 30 grand. The startup went under, so I had to just go with this stuff. Having said that, yeah, the eyes do have it. Ocular parameters could tell you a similar, if not comparable, amount of information as the brain scan would. Having said that, though, easier to build this into a helmet. Or into a cap, as opposed to eyeglasses, which the users are going to have their own prescriptions, their own, how can I say it, their own individual versions of eye tracking, as opposed to the brain chemistry, which is much more simpler.
Could the eye tracking be done to design the user interface? With stress, where's the eye looking to when they get stressed to find an answer? I've seen that done with software development.
You could do that. You could do that. But what I think you'd find is counterintuitive results. I think you'd find staring off into space would correlate with productive workflow.
Oh, interesting.
But that would be a more complex discussion, mostly because, staring off into space, you could actually be, as I'm doing, you could be thinking about something. The point with the ocular measures is they need a little bit more software to actually get it. And I suspect that's probably why the glasses were 30 grand. They need a little bit more software to get all the information flow working just right. Because there's a whole ton of just eye movement parameters. It's not just one thing. But it certainly can tell you comparable.
Yes, that's cool. So yeah, you're right. You just embed it in a cap that says like Cyber Force or something on it.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
And that way it's just swag.
The cooler it looks, the more people are going to have it.
Yeah, or you put some pithy comment on the front of it or something.
Well, this particular type of scanner, it's fascinating you say that. This particular type of scanner is built into F1 pilots' helmets, and they use that to guide their. So when the US Air Force send fighter pilots up, they actually do dose them up on dexamphetamine because it completely prevents that drop off. There are side effects, but they're actually quite minimal relative to what the drug is. Either way, it's also the usability of the technology. So there was a brain scanner I was considering using in this project, different type. It's about the size of a pizza box. And I can't see someone going to work with a pizza box on their head. Willingly, very well. So yeah, absolutely. Usability in this space is another issue because you can measure a whole ton of things. But
and it's not like you could turn the whole room into an MRI. So yeah.
Much to my chagrin, I know. That's actually what I'm talking about. The alternate brain device I was talking about, it was a wearable MRI machine, which I would have had to build myself. But there is a day that is going to come. But for now, though, it's actually called a poor man's fMRI. It works out the same thing, but just using a very different tech. I guess. But there will come a day where it's a human in the loop. So
if you could build it and just tell people we're shooting lasers into your head, you'd probably have at least half of the geek population go and say that it was okay.
Yeah. Sign me up.
It's had lasers. Yeah. Right.
Lasers.
In effect, it's the computer filling out the user.
Yeah.
And to be more neurocognitively efficient in how your users are operating your security systems. But it's really prime movers like Amazon that are going to take topics like cybersecurity and psychology. It's going to be the example of your Amazons of the world that actually set the stage for other people to follow suit, because it is the wetware problem.
Yeah.
You want the wetware problem solved, you need to. That falls in the domain of the psychologists and the brain scientists. I suppose. Well, I think that might sound arrogant, of course, coming from me, but I don't know. Like topics like this.
Yeah.
What do you reckon?
Yeah, it's interesting. I reckon, there's a bunch of small cybersecurity players here in Perth, and there's also a company named CyberCX, which are actually a national company that they went out and bought 13, maybe 14 cybersecurity providers across the country,
Wow, really?
including 2 here. And they're the sorts of people that run their own SOCs and are very, very successful at it. And I'm sure that they actually have this sort of problem.
It's not just the SOC level problem.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's a problem in military, especially as well. Because like picture this as well. So the Americans have just tried to get out of Ramadi in Afghanistan and Kabul. Well, those are areas which, if you've got a drone network operating, someone wearing a massive long antenna has to go out whilst being shot at into the battlefield so you can get a connection out there. And then someone has to do cybersecurity to that. Because if he gets caught, your drone network is now open to infiltration. So it's one thing to perform network defense on an IDS in a nice office like this. Another thing entirely to do it out in the middle of nowhere whilst being shot at. So it's you really want to understand the neurology of the people that are actually going to be doing this job, and to take into consideration third dimensional factors like being shot at. I've got to give here's another one for you. I'll give you 2 twins who both work in the exact same SOC, exact same IDS. Twin A gets out of bed, kisses his wife on the way out the door in the morning, has an easy commute to work, gets a coffee, and he's ready to sit down by 9. Twin B, on the other hand, has an argument with his missus on the way out the door, finds out his kid is failing school, gets a speeding ticket, a parking ticket, and then arrives late. Out of those 2 people, who do you think is going to be more stressed at 9 a.m. and who's going to be more work ready?
Someone's having a bad day.
Someone's having a bad day, but this gives the SOC manager the ability to measure, hang on, what's wrong with Steve over here? Yeah. Steve, are you all right? Do you maybe need to go and have a lie down or have a late morning today? Because we don't need you missing a DDoS or missing a corporate privacy violation.
Every day.
Yeah.
They could just be adulthood. The closer it gets to be. But the point is that it gives you a data-driven way of asking questions like that about your analysts. And talking about that work ethic component of it earlier, when you don't have to guess what the problem is, when you can measure what the problem is, that means that your ability to work the problem also changes. Because over long periods of time, this could do things like detect if an analyst has diabetes and that hasn't been diagnosed. See, often as is the case in pathologies, if you've got almost a problem, it can be missed. So you've almost got depression. Like, not enough for depression, but almost. Same thing with diabetes. This sort of system could pick that up over time. For example, geez, Jill really runs out of steam pretty early in the day. Why is that? Is she eating correctly? Is she having breakfast? That's an important thing. Okay, you're eating breakfast properly, your diet's fine, your water's fine. Oh, hang on, she's actually just not able to handle insulin.
Right.
It changes how the person is cared for, changes completely how they behave at work as well.
Yeah, interesting.
But again, the power of that, it's a data-driven insight. You're not relying on things like empathy or like a gut feeling. Maybe Steve does just need a break because he's got a new baby. That might be the case. But when you can see it in data and justify it in data, that is also important for things like cybersecurity insurance. Or so, for example, airline pilots. If they rock up to work, they are breathalyzed. No, sorry, when they rock up to work, they're breathalyzed. Because the airlines have to pay a certain amount of insurance so that, like, okay, our pilots aren't going to crash because of alcoholism. Not what I'm saying here in a cybersecurity situation. But what it does give you is, much like the blood alcohol measurements of a pilot dictate how much insurance they pay, the same thing could apply to a SOC. So cybersecurity insurance, well, okay, does the SOC actually monitor the attention levels of all of its workers? Were all of the workers at the time of the incident, were they all crisp and shipshape? Those are legitimate questions that can and should be asked in terms of managing cyber risk, because the human element, this manages it.
Just around that, on the data you collected, sort of I don't know, like, how big was the sample size, or did you sort of like duration, sort of like the data you got on like a Monday versus a Friday? Did you see any sort of bad day sort of data come through or outliers?
Tuesdays are the worst. Fridays and Thursdays are the best. Tuesdays and Wednesdays are the worst. Actually, I saw interesting. The sample size was 25 participants. Saw interesting information insofar as experience was concerned. That was an informative one. So the range of experience of the people in the sample I think we had was a minimum of 2, maximum of 35. It was a very one chap had quite a great deal of experience in the space. But what I found was that for anyone who has more than 5 years experience, as long, like the sweet spot is you want 5 relevant years of experience. Now you can have 30 years of experience, that's great, but how many DDoS attacks were common when Commodore machines were common? It's not the same space. So you might have 30, sorry, you're looking at me here. So you might have 30 years of experience, that's great. But what matters, it seems, insofar as my data is concerned, people who had at least 5 years of experience, after 5, it tended to drop off. 5 relevant years of experience, those were the prime performers. Unfortunately, though, those were also people who were young. Not unfortunately, those were also your younger subset of the people. So this would be between say 25 and say 32. Yeah, 25 to 32. So say fresh out of masters sort of age cohort. Those were your prime performers. But it makes sense though as well because they're young. The system that regulates all of those metabolites is less likely to be maligned as a result of age. For example, the older you get, the more likely it is you have diabetes, less so if you're younger. So I think that, overall general health also applies to this. But you do see, insights like that, you do see some odd things. Tuesdays are very much a bad day for cybersecurity operations centers. That much was a very noticeable component.
Tuesdays.
I'm going to take Tuesdays off from now on, but I'm going to tell my friends that they should run cyber attacks on Tuesdays.
Tell them not to answer their emails on Tuesdays because that's also when phishing attacks are most likely to be successful. Like by a lot, it's always a Tuesday. I think it's Monday you get into work, you're actually dealing with stuff. By Tuesday you've got enough mental capacity to be distracted by a phishing scam. But
Nice.
yeah. But to answer your question, what's next for me? Got no idea. Got no idea. I would love to continue to stay in the cybersecurity space, continuing to do psychological sorts of things, mostly because the amount of work in this space is just huge. But,
It's always growing.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your
Cool.
time.
Thank you.
Super interesting.
Thank you.
Let's stop that recording, which is all good.